What's going down, everybody? Welcome back to another altered art tutorial video. Today we're going to slow it down a little bit and we're going to take a closer look at how I blend skies, some of the color. It's still going to be a time-lapse video, but it's not going to be quite as fast. You can see all the materials in my bouncy camera there. We've got burnt sienna, black, regular blue, regular white, and it's a mixture of all the different paints. I've done a video on what kind of paints I've used in the past, as well as brushes. I've got my new camera set up there, and I'm going to do my best job that I can to keep all my mixing kind of on camera view where you can see it. And remember, this is just going to be part one, and part two is going to be where we see the finished card. So let's get to it. I start off with just blue and white, and realistically this is going to be like 9 parts white to 1 part blue. And you can see I'm trying to go around all of the fancy border and stuff, but that doesn't actually matter because it's going to all have to get cleaned up anyways. So I kind of just work my way around. I'm careful to keep everything very thin, everything very flat. And when I say thin, I don't necessarily mean watering the paints down thin. What I mean is making the layers very thin so they don't appear as though they are textured in any way. And you can see that I've mixed in some brown there. I use brown, burnt sienna in particular, in almost all of my skies. Just kind of how value systems work. There is some atmosphere in the way of whatever the farthest away thing that you're looking at is. And that atmosphere kind of manifests itself usually very sparingly. So if it's 1 part blue to 9 parts white, you could even take even less than that and add brown. And you can kind of see my mix pile as I'm working on it. But I kind of just make my way through the card and I blend in, and you can see me tap with my finger a little bit. That removes a bunch of the paint, but leaves a little bit of it on there. And that is just going to let me feather it in ever so slightly. And you can see it kind of just, after a while of feathering it in, it kind of just feathers away to nothing. And that's how you get a really smooth, flat blend. I'm using a relatively new paintbrush, it looks like in this video. So I don't do a whole ton of dry brush kind of stroking onto the surface of the direct cardstock. I can do that once the brush wears down a little bit because it doesn't hold as much paint. Maybe in future videos I'll show you kind of how as the brush wears down you can kind of change the technique that you use to blend. You can see I added some black there, and you can see that trying to go around that legendary name line is just kind of a lost cause. It just doesn't matter. You just have to clean it up. And I think that's all covered in, it might be covered now, it might be covered in part 2. I painted this card a little while ago, but I was recently asked if I paint around stuff or if I use toothpicks or some amount of effort to clean stuff up. And I never paint around stuff, and I never mask anything off with masking tape or anything like that. I clean around everything after I've painted over it. And that lets the paint look like it's behind whatever I've painted or whatever the subject is. You see how I'm going over the wing? I'm going to toothpick that back so it looks like the wing is in front. But it's important that it's done this way to make sure that there's no lines or no texture to that paint because you're trying to paint around something. And again, you see me going into the art and then tapping it kind of off with my finger to get rid of some of the paint, some of the texture. Helps flatten it out a little bit. And you can see me there wipe it right off. The paint does have a little bit of I'll call it a texture, but realistically it's just because it's not gloss. It's a little bit flat, a little bit satin, and you can put a wet layer down like that and then wipe it off with your finger. Some of it's going to stay in the actual granular texture that is the paint when it dries, and you can get a really fine looking cloud like that. Sometimes I do that with shadows as well, or when I need very slight color variation. That's how I'll do it. And now on to the cleaning. The cleaning of these legendary name line is so tedious, and it usually involves a mistake, particularly right exactly on the edges, that you have to go back and remix the exact same color of paint and blend it back in, or cover up where you scraped off too much. So when you're learning how to do these, take extreme care with that legendary name line to make your altars look very clean, very professional. If you're taking on commissions and you get a legendary creature, a legendary card in some way, I would suggest that you consider in your pricing method or pricing model that these cards be priced a little bit higher, because this does take extra time. And I don't want to make it about trying to teach you guys how to make money altering cards, but when I get cards like this, I know that I tell people these cards take more time, and therefore I charge a little bit of a different amount for them. So I've got my rough clean done, and then I go back and fix up anywhere that I've kind of screwed up with the toothpick. I make sure it all matches, and then I go back to the toothpick. So you're going to see me go back and forth a few times to really get the borders tight, clean, and again, clean and professional looking. You see all the time new altruists, they're not taking their time, they're not spending the amount of time that it takes to go around all of the tiny pin lines and the little details on the name line. And essentially that's the top of the card. That's the part that we're going to look at, see, read very first when the card gets put down on the table. So again, spend the time to make them look clean. Back and forth, back and forth. And the thing about doing it this way too, you got to remember, is acrylics usually dry maybe a shade or two darker than when you first put them down wet. So it might look like you didn't mix the same color, but just be wary that you do have to let those little tiny brush strokes around the name line, you have to let those dry to see what they really look like before you can know if you're done or not. So we're going to finish up with this video right now. Be back for part 2. We're going to see what this card looks like when it's all done. Thanks for being here, everybody. If you like altered cards, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in part 2.